Hi guys, this is John Edward Willey, and I'm feeling philosophical. And this morning I'd like to sort of explore a question that is kind of fundamental to where my studies are at right now, and that has to do with the origins of Western philosophy. The question that I have is, how exactly did Western philosophy begin around, say, 600 BC in Greece? And what I mean specifically is a real question. It's not a question that's sort of rhetorical or loaded, although I have a good handful of ideas as to how philosophy began emerging. The real mystery has to do with this eruption of something we call the Greek world. We don't really understand exactly how it is that Greek society emerged, which includes not just philosophy, but also a number of other things, from democracy to art to athletics to a multitude of projects and ways of being in the world that are very much who we are. In fact, that's the strange thing about the ancient Greeks, is that we see ourselves emerging as who we are. It's sort of like the invisible architecture of our own minds is being built at this time. Like if we were a ship, ancient Greece is sort of the shipyard where we are being built. And I've been studying it for a long time out of just curiosity, because if you're philosophical, you naturally wonder about the origins of philosophy. And that's not to say that other people and cultures don't philosophize. I mean, obviously they do, but there's something singular about the Greek way of philosophizing. And that in itself is not so mysterious, because what we know about the ancient Greeks that really separates them from all the other civilizations and empires that were surrounding them is their insistence upon explanations that worked within this world. So in other words, they were looking for answers that didn't point outwards, that explained themselves by referring to the natural order of the world. And at first it sounds almost really trite or silly, and yet there's a sense in which one is missing what is so critical about the emergence of rationality, about the emergence of rational thinking in the ancient Greeks. And so it's interesting that it begins in a place that's sort of like a nexus or a meeting point between different worlds, And what I'm talking about is what they call pre-Socratic philosophy, the philosophy that comes before Socrates, that really created like the basis for Plato and Aristotle. That emerges from a nexus that is made up of a merchant class. And a merchant class meaning people who are primarily trading. And by trading, we mean on the seas. The ancient Greeks were what we call, in many ways, sea people. Of course, they occupied the island of Greece, or the mainland of Greece, as well as a number of Aegean islands. But because they were in a position where they were really squeezed between Egypt and Mesopotamia and other civilizations that they were trading with, that they were basically exchanging merchandise, effectively trading, but also trading ideas. Because you'll notice that if you pay attention to what happens when lots of different people who have almost nothing in common get together, I mean, that's when the real shit starts popping off. That's when the real fascinating stuff starts happening. And I don't mean people who think differently, I mean people who live differently. Because you have to imagine that the Greeks, perhaps as something even more fundamental than rationality, they were observing their brothers and sisters in Babylonia and Egypt and in Persia, and what they were ultimately, it seems to us, we're guessing, they ultimately seemed to figure out that not everybody could be right, or that there was a sense in which there was something like an underlying principle working itself out, meaning that there was a kind of order within the diversity of a multitude of views. That in many ways is a Greek idea. And like rational people like to attribute it to their own rationality as if it were a scientific process. But the emergence of Greek rationality in about 600 BC is actually a lot more related to mythology and the religious beliefs at the time than we really remember. And what I mean by that is that it isn't just in Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Pythagoras, where this principle of rational explanation emerges. Rationality as such emerges, it's sort of hinted at in the works of the preSocratics, meaning Homer, like the one who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, as well as Hesiod, who is a sort of another kind of quasi-religious thinker in the ancient Greek world. And of course, it's probably important to remember that the ancient Greeks were in fact as ancient as they are to us. In other words, Homer wasn't really even connected to the ancient Greeks who developed philosophy. So he was already ancient. And what they were doing is sort of pulling on, teasing on these little hints, these little notions that exist in Homer and Hesiod and other pre-Socratic playwriters like Sophocles and Aeschylus. Because prior to philosophy emerging, we have the existence of tragedy in ancient Greece, which is another kind of contribution of theirs. And in Greek tragedy and in the cyclical telling of Greek stories like the Iliad, in many ways they begin playing around with pseudo-rational ideas. And so the pre-Socratics like Thales and Anaximander in many ways are responding to these problems in a way that is highly unique. And what is highly unique is that they're using ideas. In other words, they're using ideas that are allowing them to think clearly in a way that produces a rational explanation that can also be sort of questioned by other people. Because see, that's another key thing about the ancient Greeks, is that they were wanting to create a kind of methodology where criticism from other people would be a good thing. You know, and again, if you step back and look at the nature of empires, if you look at the nature of other civilizations, you don't really find the existence of this kind of particular dialectical back and forth. And this dialectical back and forth is the production of knowledge, because it means that people can test the things that you say, and in testing them, they can give you something that's very valuable, which is proof that it's incorrect. And proof that it's incorrect effectively saves you time. And so what you have in pre-Socratic philosophy that is so powerful isn't really just the philosophers themselves. It's not Thales and Anaximander or Pythagoras. It's the fact that Pythagoras was responding to Thales, at least it seems, and he was qualifying him. He was trying to sort of set him straight. And of course, when we look at their theories, the theories that they produced, it all seems really quite ludicrous. You know, to believe that water is the nature of the universe, or that mathematics is the nature of the universe. But all of that is really secondary to the underlying production of a dialectical system that is like a back and forth kind of exchange between people that produces something, it seems, that's bigger than them. And whether or not that something that is produced is really bigger than them is really the question, you know, because it goes in many different kinds of directions, and that multitude of directions is Western philosophy itself, whether it's in Plato or Aristotle or Kant or Nietzsche or Hegel or Hume. All of it is basically a flowering of the underlying emergence of this idea that the world is rational. We think of that as natural, and it is, of course, to be questioned. But we begin with the idea that we are rational people, and that the world is rational, and that we can produce rational explanations of things. I mean, that's astonishing. Like, what is a rational explanation? And so that is the question, you know. I mentioned that it begins in in the Aegean Sea. It begins in Ionia and what is now Anatolia, which is modern Turkey. And this place, Miletus, where Thales emerges, is at the very most eastern part of Asia. And not only that, what I find to be interesting is that this area in modern Turkey, where pre-Socratic philosophy emerges, is also the same site where 9,000 years earlier, in a Paleolithic era, agriculture had formed. And it's during the Neolithic era, so this is way before Plato, way before Homer. But what happens is that agriculture and farming first emerges here in the Neolithic period and then spreads into Africa and into Asia from this place. So it's sort of like indicative of another kind of traveling exchange of ideas that is almost like farming, is almost like planting and philosophy might have something in common. You know, what could agriculture and the emergence of philosophy even have in common? And so that's the question that I have as I'm sort of creating a basis for what I hope to do in the near future regarding the explication of philosophy. So I'm John Edward Willie, and this is Circle 8. And so let me know what you think about the emergence of Western philosophy in ancient Greece.